In the course of Van Leer's regular work, it is very seldom that we have a topic that we deal with that is not on the national agenda or that is of only limited value. But of all the topics that we deal with, I think that the question of the Palestinian prisoners embodies in it the quintessential of the conflict between us and the Palestinians. It is a topic that is not intellectually or politically articulated well enough in the agenda of the Israeli body politic. On the other hand, it is felt intimately and emotionally in the keenest of possible ways. And I think that this is one of the reasons that explain the sparsity of the people attending these meetings. The question of Palestinian prisoners and the release of Palestinian prisoners goes to the heart of what the Israeli average citizen feels about the cost, the risks, and the benefits of the peace agreement between the two parties. The emotionalism that it invokes, in my opinion, is higher and more volatile than the typical conventional issues of final status, the status of Jerusalem, and even the question of return. I think that the prisoners, for the Palestinians, and for the average Joe on the Israeli street, embodies the most difficult emotional hurdle to overcome. So I'm not sure if we can address the question in all of its ramifications. It has legal ramifications, it has psychological ramifications, and it has this, very little mundane question or side to it, which is the question of security. Every little, failure, every little mistake, wrong step that is taken can trigger, and usually will trigger, a huge wave of emotional, negative reaction to any kind of risk-taking that the Israeli government, in its infinite wisdom or hesitation, will dare to take. I don't want to say more because every minute that I would take is at the expense of a brief and shortened agenda, and it comes at the expense of the ambassador. I want to introduce His Excellency, Mr. Hennessy, whose visit, or my visit, and Amit Lesher, I don't see her now, several of us, including Hisham Abdelbazek, a visit to Ireland triggered that event. We were so impressed and surprised to find that despite of the emotions of a people known not for its aloofness or lack of emotions, that in spite of the emotions of the Northern Ireland conflict, were able to overcome the fears that we don't seem to be able to. So I'm looking with great interest to see his presentation, and I wish all of us a very fruitful and a meaningful discussion of a very important topic.
Mr. Chairman and friends, I would first of all like to thank the Van Leer Institute for inviting me to take part in this very interesting discussion symposium on a very important and very sensitive topic. And I appreciate the sensitivity and importance in the context in which all of you are interested in the context of the problem here in this region, precisely because of being fully aware of the sensitivity and the importance that the issue played in efforts to move forward in relation to the Irish peace process. Now, I appreciate there are people here with perhaps vastly different degrees of information, background about the Irish political situation, and indeed there's a sort of stereotypical story about the visitor. It might well have been an Israeli visitor or a visitor from this region who comes to Ireland and stops at a crossroad and asks somebody for directions, and then to which they get the answer, "If I were you, I wouldn't start from here." And to some extent, this kind of comment or thought arises when one begins to sort of pick apart any one individual component of what, by definition, a peace process is, which is a multifaceted project where the key to success in many respects is to move forward on a range of fronts at once. But that said, in order to better understand how that works, one needs from time to time to break it down into its constituent elements, and that's obviously what we hope to do this afternoon in relation to the topic of prisoners. I mean, just very briefly to give a context on this, in terms of Irish history, Ireland had been part of the United Kingdom for many hundreds of years, up to the late 19th, early 20th century, and an independence movement became more and more active into the early years of the 20th century. You had a rebellion in 1916, which eventually led into a sort of a guerrilla war type campaign between 16 and 21. And in the course of that, of course, there were many people who were active in the independence movement who were arrested and in custody. And from that time, I mean, and one could find many examples in earlier rebellions and revolutions, of which this was simply a continuation of the trend. But all of that tended to reinforce the sense that you find, I think, probably in every society where there has been this sense of breaking loose from an occupying force of some kind, the sense of the role of the prisoner, and this validation, this elevation of the prisoner as a key element in the history and in the self-image of the society. So that was the broad context going as we as it were went into the going into the 20th century. Coming out of the 1920s, the political setup in Ireland was basically you had an independent, what became the Irish Republic, in 4/5 of the island of Ireland, and in the northeast section you had the area of Northern Ireland, which remained under British jurisdiction. This reflected the fact that a local majority within that area remained strongly attached to their British roots, but there was also a sizable minority of 35, which eventually became 40% or so, which strongly retained its links with the rest of the island, and which never really accepted this division. And this in turn created a basis for a good deal of instability in the years that followed. This remained largely in the realm of politics rather than taking a more violent turn. Coming into the late 1960s, you had perhaps drawing inspiration from events elsewhere in the world, the civil rights movement and so on in the States. You had a strong push to remedy some of the human rights, the discriminatory malpractices which had become a feature for the minority in Northern Ireland. But this, for a variety of reasons, lack of progress and among others, transformed itself over a number of years into a more violent struggle, and you had groups coming out of both communities, extremist groups, who resorted to violence to advance their political agenda. And that set the theme for a rather barren period through the 70s and 80s, indeed into the early 90s, with a low but still obviously unacceptable level of violence carrying on over a very long period, and of course with mounting fatalities, over 3,000 deaths during that period. As we came into the 90s, there was, I think, particularly on the part of the Republican movement, which was the group that grew out of the minority, the nationalist minority, an increasing awareness that their military efforts, their military campaign was not going anywhere, and that rethinking was required. Of course, all along you had both the Irish political parties, the Irish government, plus the majority of the minority in Northern Ireland had always advocated a political track as the only way to go forward, but they needed to persuade the more extreme elements to follow that course. Finally, in the 90s, the process began to move, and I think that at least at the leadership level, there began to be a greater understanding that a political campaign and a political approach was much more likely to yield results than a campaign of violence. So this set the context for what eventually became a number of, first of all, ceasefires, and this in turn eventually led to the Good Friday Agreement, which was signed in 1998. That's a very sort of rushed overview, but in the course of that, of those years, from 1960, essentially almost 1968 up into the 90s, obviously there were a very large number of arrests from the groups in both in the what are generally referred to as the Republican community and the Loyalist community, those who would be strong supporters of maintaining the link with Britain. While initially there were a period when people were simply detained without trial, that was dropped when it became clear that the fact of detention and the practice of detention was itself a very destabilising factor in the wider community, and was simply fed greater unrest. So eventually there was a system in Northern Ireland, a system of courts established which operated without juries, and indeed a similar type system of what are called special criminal courts was also established in the Republic to deal with the much smaller number, but still those who were arrested in the southern jurisdiction and charged with offences related to the conflict in Northern Ireland. So through this period, you had a very sizable number of persons taken into custody. Estimates of about 30,000 persons held in prison in Northern Ireland, about half from each community. A much smaller number in prison in the south, more in hundreds. But this was the overall context. Coming into the 90s, when, as I say, the political process began to gain ground, when the leadership, which is associated with groups such as Sinn Féin, of which you may have heard, became more open to the idea that a diplomatic stroke political campaign was more likely to yield results. The task began both from inside these groups, but also obviously from those outside the governments, the Irish government, the British government, and indeed interested parties, particularly in the United States, who were helping and who wanted to nudge these groups into the diplomatic process. The need for the importance of persuasion and of creating conditions when this would happen became very striking. And it was in this context that the role of the prisoners really came to the fore. It was obvious from a relatively early stage that, echoing previous campaigns, that the prisoners, of course, almost by definition, were senior figures in the organisations that they came from. They were looked to by their communities as authentic, as legitimate voices. After all, they had suffered for the cause in the local terminology, and they were now doing time behind bars because of their commitment to their cause. And this, of course, gave them, as it does elsewhere, including not in environments near here, a degree of validity and legitimacy, which makes them extremely important in persuading the communities which sustain these groups that certain changes, certain transformations need to be made. And this was understood, I think, quite well by all of the governments and all of the sort of the responsible outside parties directly involved, that the prisoners' role was going to be critical in making it possible for the leadership of these organisations to bring their supporters with them into essentially abandoning their campaigns of violence and to engaging in politics and eventually in negotiation. Back as early as the first ceasefire of 1994, the then Irish government responded with a limited programme of prison releases following that. You then had the Mitchell Commission, the Senator George Mitchell, who of course is well known also for his proposals and plans in this area, brought out an important report which tried to map the way forward, and it, among other things, identified prisoners as an issue that would require careful attention in the context, as I said at the outset, of putting together the kind of package which you require in our situation, and indeed I think what you require in any situation of this kind. This takes us up to eventually to 1998, when we get the comprehensive negotiations, which, after a great deal of effort, eventually resulted in this comprehensive agreement concluded in April of 1998. Now, it had a number of key components. Obviously, at the top were the constitutional arrangements, what's referred to in Irish terminology as the three strands. In other words, arrangements which will relate to the government within Northern Ireland, arrangements for links between North and South, which are very important to nationalists because of the sense of Irish identity, which is to them a key component, but also, and if you think of this as three concentric circles, in the outer circle, the arrangements for linkages between North and South in Ireland and Britain, again reflecting the British loyalty and the British identity that's important to the Unionist community. So that was there, but it was also, and this had been well understood in the negotiations, that for such a delicate balance to be acceptable and to be saleable in the various communities, you had to address a number of other key issues. This included, for example, human rights protection, the putting in place of elaborate mechanisms, new legislation, new monitoring organisations, new bodies, and so on, which would oversee and protect human rights. It related to policing, to establishing of a new policing service, one which could command support from both sides of the community. It's related to the vexed issue of weapons, which is still being talked about, and of course it related to the issue of prisoners. The prisoners issue was also addressed, and it was understood by everybody that you could not envisage having an agreement which did not have, as it were, a prisoners chapter as part of that agreement. There's an American term which is also used very much here, of deliverables. That it's very important with a process like this, when you're trying to bring communities to some new ground, new political ground, that there be some immediate sense of change, and that there be a change, a new reality, so that the compromises which may be involved in the wider spectrum are, as it were, compensated for by the sense that things are getting better very quickly at grassroots level, and that particularly the supporters of the groups for whom the political chapter may be the most difficult, that they see some practical benefit for what they've done, and prisoners very much, and the arrangements for speedy release of prisoners was certainly understood in the context of the Irish agreement as a deliverable that needed to be front-loaded and to be dealt with on a broad front. So the agreement provides that the two governments, the Irish and the British governments, were to put in place mechanisms to provide for what's referred to as an accelerated programme for the release of prisoners who were serving sentences connected to the conflict. Now, the key point there was that basically there was an elaborate mechanism of commissioners and people making applications, but the bottom line was that everybody was to be out within 2 years of the cancellation of this agreement being agreed, and in fact, in many cases, it happened much earlier than that. In the case of the government in the south, the Dublin government, this, as I say, a number had been released in response to an earlier ceasefire, and this was quickly followed by further releases as the agreement came into effect. The Good Friday Agreement also included an acknowledgement of the fact that it was important that measures be put in place to assist with the reintegration of prisoners. In other words, it's not just a question of sort of opening the gates and letting people out, but that you also you try to find ways of ensuring that they are able to respond positively and to be reintegrated into the communities that from which they come. All of this agreement as a whole was endorsed in referenda, which for the first time since the Irish state had been established were held on the same day, north and south. And they were passed with a very large majority in the south, and with a somewhat smaller but still a clear majority in Northern Ireland. So that was basically the way the system was organised. Subsequently, as the discussions between the Irish and British governments continued on implementing the agreement and dealing with the problems which arose and which indeed are still being dealt with. One of the issues that came up was what to do about what are referred to as on the run. In other words, those who were being sought by the authorities, but who were not actually obviously in prison. And there was an understanding reached that legislation would be put on the books as part of the sort of the final comprehensive resolution of any outstanding issues, which essentially would extend the release, the system, or essentially an amnesty type system to those who were on the run, provided that they and their organisations continued to uphold the process and to support the agreement. And that's still awaiting this package of final issues that are being worked on still. But it's an acknowledgement that is also a category, as it were, that needs to be taken into account. What so I think just the overall, in terms of, just to give you an idea of the scale, I think the figures are roughly something like 450 prisoners were released in Northern Ireland under this Good Friday Agreement, and about 104 were released in prisons in the Republic, also through this process. It was also understood, it was part of the arrangement that if prisoners who were released on this arrangement, following their release, again became involved in violence, that that this release would be declared invalid, and they would be returned to complete their sentences. So that's essentially the sort of how it has worked. What lessons, what conclusions might we draw from that? I think first of all is the obvious one, that certainly in the Irish situation, the prisoners are indeed a core issue and had to be integrated into the effort at conflict resolution. It would have been inconceivable to try to put a package like the Good Friday Agreement together, and indeed we would never have got to the stage of having the parties around the table to try to do that if it hadn't been clear from the outset and signalled very expressly to the parties that prisoners were indeed a part of this issue and the issue would have to be addressed. I mean, key aspects of this include obviously in a conflict resolution situation, the humanitarian one. Many of these are young, very often young prisoners. The conditions that they're being held in are clearly often far from ideal, and that one has to simply address that at the humanitarian level. But beyond that, there is the point, as I say, that the prisoners in these kind of conflict situations have a key role as a validator, as a source of political legitimacy. Beyond that, there's also a key, what I might call a multiplier effect. You simply by virtue of the number of persons who are likely to be in prison in these situations, when you take their immediate families and perhaps their relatives and friends, often the size of the total pool in your community that's affected by prisoners' issues is very large, and you can as it were, if you can bring that constituency with you on the difficult task of getting political agreement, then that's clearly a major asset. And by contrast, if you don't have that constituency with you, it's a major hurdle to overcome as you try to build support for agreement and compromise. I think it was reckoned in Northern Ireland that with some 30,000 people having been in prison, if you even with a small multiplier effect, you end up with about 1 in 15 of the population either themselves or had a close relative who had served time in prison. So that just simply on the numbers, and obviously in this region, one could also, I'm sure, point to statistics of large magnitude. The final additional point might be that they very often, and certainly this was, I think, true in the Irish context, the people who tend to emerge in these prison situations as leaders very often are people with whose leadership skills will have been further developed, often indeed through study. I mean, a prison can often serve as a great university, and certainly in the Irish context, there are very many cases where people have come out of people who have served time related to the conflict have come out to take a very prominent leadership role in their own communities, and very, very often, I mean, in by far the majority of cases, in a very positive sense. They tend, and there are many examples of this, to be people who are able to lead by example, who have the street credit, as it were, and the street credibility by virtue of their acceptance in the community. So when they lead their community and their people in a positive direction, this can be a real energizer and really help to get beyond the actions of people, however well-intentioned, people who want to do good from on high, as it were, often will run into difficulties which can only be overcome when you get local forces. And there's certainly in the Irish context there's a very strong sense of a pool of savvy, politically aware, community-oriented leaders who have done very good work in post-conflict transformation, and so that's also an asset which, if it's used well, can be helpful. Beyond that, obviously there is in all of this there is clearly this is while these kind of approaches clearly are while many of us would argue necessary, they're also clearly difficult, and they're particularly difficult, obviously, for victims. They're difficult for victims, for their families, who will find it not easy to cope with the concept that those people who have perhaps brought great sorrow to them and to their families being somehow as it will be perceived, avoiding having to sort of pay the price of their actions. And I suppose all one can do is to try to have as open and as genuine a dialogue as it's possible to have involving the victims and their families, so that you can create hopefully some kind of at least at least acquiescence at a minimum, hopefully something more positive than that, of the value from a community point of view, from the point of view of society as a whole, in taking things to the next step. But one should certainly not ignore it. So all of this is I think has certainly confirmed in from an Irish perspective the centrality of the prisoners' issue. Beyond that, I think, as I said at the outset, one can't, and again this will be our experience, one has to situate any of these concepts in the overall framework, in the wider framework. One cannot try to sort of solve any one problem on the basis that you can leave everything else frozen. So you simply have to, I think, at least in our experience, tackle root causes and a broadly based approach. You have to have a comprehensive approach. And those on both sides of the conflict who want to move forward, I suppose, have to find the strength and have to be given the encouragement to hold together even when things get difficult. This is obviously easier in the context of where there's a plan, a route map that people are following, and it provides something to cling to in when you inevitably get those bad days, when there will be when you get the atrocity, which we certainly had this in Ireland. The Omagh was a town in Northern Ireland, suffered very badly at one particular key moment, and it was only because there was enough common understanding between the governments and between the parties who wanted to move forward that has allowed them to overcome this setback. There's also the role of the international community is also, I think, can be important in helping parties to, as it were, achieve their full potential. But all that maybe for another day. I just really want to again thank you all very much. I think you've identified a very important topic, and certainly one which we have found has to be at the heart of peacemaking. Thank you very much.